The air was sharp with cold, the kind that made the earth feel frozen in time. The lake stretched out in perfect stillness, undisturbed beneath the early morning sky. A deep blue reflection mirrored the silence above, broken only by the occasional ripple of movement. The world was quiet, the kind of morning that felt like any other. Mike Williams was awake before dawn, following the routine that had become second nature to him. Hunting was his escape, a ritual that let him slip away from the weight of daily obligations. Work, marriage, fatherhood. He was methodical, a man who planned every detail. His shotgun was cleaned and ready, his gear packed the night before. There was no hesitation in his steps as he loaded the truck. No reason to believe this trip would be any different from the dozens that had come before it. The house was silent as he left. Denise, his wife, had stirred briefly when he got up, but had said little. She watched him from the doorway as he adjusted his jacket, the early morning chill already setting in. "How long will you be out?" Mike barely glanced back. "Just the morning." With that, he was gone. The hours passed. By midday, Denise expected to hear from him. A quick call, a message, some sign that he was on his way home. But there was nothing. She called once. No answer. She called again. The phone rang, but no one picked up. By mid-afternoon, unease crept in. She tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was delayed. Maybe he had lost track of time. But as the minutes stretched into hours, that unease turned to something else. She called Mike's mother, Cheryl. The moment Cheryl picked up, she knew something was wrong. "He hasn't come home?" Cheryl's voice was sharp with worry. "Number I tried calling him. He's not answering." Silence hung between them before Cheryl spoke again. "We need to call the police." The response was immediate. By late afternoon, authorities were at Lake Seminole, searching for any sign of Mike. His truck was found exactly where it should have been, parked near the water's edge. The doors were locked. His boat trailer was empty, his small vessel missing. The ground was undisturbed, as if he had simply vanished. As night fell, divers combed the waters, their flashlights cutting through the murky depths. The assumption was simple. Mike must have fallen in. Maybe a misstep, maybe the boat had tipped. It had happened before, but the lake gave up nothing. Days passed. Search teams worked tirelessly, dragging the water, scanning the shoreline. Hope faded with each hour that passed. Then nearly a week after he disappeared, they found something. Floating near the shore were a pair of waders, a jacket, and his shotgun. They were strangely untouched. No sign of struggle, no rips or damage. The shotgun was in pristine condition, as if it had been carefully placed rather than lost. And then, the most baffling discovery of all, the life jacket. If Mike had drowned, why hadn't his body surfaced? A drowning victim typically rises to the surface within days, yet there was no trace of him. The lake wasn't deep enough to fully conceal a body, and the idea that alligators had consumed him, a theory that some floated, was dismissed. The water was too cold in December for alligators to be active. Despite these inconsistencies, the case was closed with a simple conclusion. Mike Williams drowned while hunting. His body was never recovered. Not everyone accepted that answer. Cheryl Williams refused to believe her son had simply disappeared. She knew him, his habits, his caution, his survival instincts. The explanation made no sense. But while Cheryl pushed for answers, others seemed eager to move on. Denise, in particular, showed little interest in prolonging the search. Within months, she filed to have Mike legally declared dead. No body, no real proof, yet the process moved quickly. Almost too quickly. 6 months after he vanished, she was awarded $1.75 million in life insurance, a policy conveniently updated just before Mike's disappearance. It might have ended there, another tragedy swallowed by time. But then something happened that no one could ignore. Denise Williams, the grieving widow, remarried. And she didn't just marry anyone. She married Brian Winchester, the man who had sold Mike his life insurance policy, the same man who had been there from the beginning. A man who, as time would reveal, knew far more than he had ever let on. The sun had barely risen when the search resumed. The morning light cast a muted glow over Lake Seminole, its surface still and unbroken, as if nature itself had swallowed the truth whole. The boats cut through the water, divers slipping beneath the surface into the cold depths, their movements slow and methodical. On land, officers combed through the brush, kicking up wet earth and fallen leaves, looking for anything, any trace, any sign, anything at all that might explain what had happened to Mike Williams. But the lake remained silent. Day after day, the search continued. What began as a desperate hunt for a missing man slowly turned into a grim reality that no one wanted to accept. With every hour that passed without a discovery, the whispers grew louder. The official explanation took hold. Mike had drowned. His body, if it was there at all, had been lost to the elements, dragged into the murky depths, or consumed by the creatures that lurked beneath the water's surface. It was a simple story, and for some, an easy one to believe. Accidents happened. Tragedy didn't always come with neat answers or satisfying conclusions. But for those who knew Mike, something about it didn't sit right. Cheryl Williams refused to accept it. She knew her son, knew his habits, his careful nature. He wasn't reckless, and he wasn't the type to take unnecessary risks. The idea that he had simply fallen into the lake, that he had drowned in the shallow waters without a trace, felt wrong in a way that she couldn't ignore. And then there were the inconsistencies. The life jacket, found floating on the surface of the lake. If Mike had been wearing it, his body would have surfaced too. If he hadn't, why was it there at all? The waders and jacket, found days later, intact and strangely undamaged. The shotgun retrieved in pristine condition, as if it had been placed rather than lost. The more Cheryl thought about it, the more questions she had. But for everyone else, the case was already closed. No body, no crime, no reason to keep looking. 6 months passed. Winter turned to spring, and with it, the reality of Mike's disappearance settled in like a shadow over his family. The search had long since ended. The lake had been combed, its depths explored and abandoned. The authorities had moved on, and slowly so did everyone else. Everyone except Cheryl. She called the sheriff's office regularly, pushing for answers, for more searches, for something, anything. But the response was always the same. There was nothing more to be done. The official ruling stood. Mike Williams was dead. And then, just like that, he was declared so in the eyes of the law. Denise filed the paperwork, her request to have Mike legally declared deceased moving through the system faster than Cheryl thought possible. There was no body, no definitive proof, and yet within months the case was finalized. It was as if he had never existed. The life insurance money came soon after. $1.75 million. For most, the story ended there. A man lost to the lake, a wife left to rebuild her life, a tragedy no one could change. But Cheryl knew better. She watched as Denise moved forward, watched as she collected the money, watched as she went on with life as if her husband had never disappeared at all. And then came the final blow. 2 years after Mike was gone, Denise remarried. Not just anyone. Brian Winchester, Mike's best friend. The man who had sold him his life insurance policies. The same man who had been there from the very beginning. The same man who, whether he admitted it or not, knew exactly what had happened. Time had a way of dulling even the sharpest tragedies. The months stretched into years, and the town of Tallahassee moved on, as small communities often did. The name Mike Williams faded from conversation, spoken only in hushed tones by those who still found the circumstances of his disappearance too strange to ignore. For many, his absence was nothing more than a painful footnote in the past, a story whispered in passing about the man who went hunting and never returned. But Cheryl Williams never let go. She was relentless, refusing to let her son's name be erased, refusing to accept the neat, convenient explanation that had been handed to her. To the world, Mike Williams was gone. To her, he was missing. Missing in a way that suggested something more sinister than a simple accident. She knew in her heart that he hadn't just vanished into the lake, that his body hadn't been claimed by alligators or lost to the depths. Something had happened to him, and Cheryl wasn't the only one who felt that way. Denise Williams' actions had been unsettling from the very beginning. Her insistence on closing the case quickly, her refusal to push for further searches, her seamless transition into widowhood, it had all seemed too calculated. She had been efficient, almost businesslike, in the way she handled her husband's disappearance, wasting no time in securing her financial future. Then came her remarriage. At first, it had been nothing more than a whisper, a quiet murmur of disbelief spreading through the community. Denise was moving on. That in itself wasn't unexpected. But who she had chosen to move on with left even the most trusting of her acquaintances uneasy. Brian Winchester, Mike's closest friend. The man who had been with him through high school, through adulthood, through nearly every stage of his life. The man who had sold him the life insurance policies that, just months after his disappearance, had turned Denise into a wealthy woman. It didn't make sense. It was too close, too personal. It felt like a betrayal, an erasure of everything that had come before. And yet, there they were, standing together, united by something no one could fully understand. The marriage was not a grand affair. There were no extravagant celebrations, no heartfelt speeches about new beginnings. Instead, it was quiet, almost secretive, as though the couple wished to avoid drawing too much attention to themselves. But people noticed. They noticed how Denise carried herself with the same detached calm she had displayed in the wake of her husband's disappearance. They noticed how Brian, once an outgoing and personable man, seemed different, tense, reserved, as if there was a weight pressing down on him that he couldn't shake. There was something else too, a change that was harder to pinpoint, but impossible to ignore. At first, Denise and Brian appeared inseparable, their bond seemingly strengthened by the shared tragedy that had brought them together. But as time passed, cracks began to form beneath the surface. Small things at first, subtle shifts in the way they interacted. Moments of hesitation that spoke of an unease neither of them could fully mask. Brian, who had always been confident and easygoing, grew more withdrawn. He became guarded, his once charismatic nature giving way to something quieter, more cautious. There were times when he seemed to shrink in Denise's presence, as if walking on a tightrope stretched too thin. Denise, on the other hand, remained as controlled as ever. If she noticed the change in Brian, she didn't acknowledge it. She carried herself with an air of quiet dominance, the kind that didn't demand attention but commanded it nonetheless. To the outside world, they were a couple who had found solace in each other after an unimaginable loss. But to those who paid attention, it was clear that their marriage was not built on love or healing. It was built on something else entirely. Brian's behavior grew more erratic over the years. He drank more. He avoided people he once considered friends. There were whispers of tension behind closed doors, of arguments that never quite turned into full-blown fights, but left behind a lingering air of unease. It wasn't long before people started to question whether the marriage had been a mistake. Some speculated that Denise had married Brian out of convenience, a way to maintain control over the narrative of Mike's disappearance. Others believed that Brian had been drawn in by guilt, by a sense of obligation that tethered him to a past he could never fully escape. Whatever the reason, one thing was certain. Brian Winchester was not the same man he had been before Mike Williams vanished. And that, Cheryl believed, was the key. She had never stopped searching for the truth. Even as law enforcement dismissed her concerns, even as people told her to move on, she had continued to push. She wrote letters, made calls, met with anyone who would listen. She pleaded with investigators to reopen the case, to take another look at the details that didn't make sense. But no one listened. Years passed and Cheryl's fight for answers remained just that, a fight, an uphill battle that seemed destined to be lost. Until one day, something changed, something that no one saw coming. Years had passed, yet the shadow of Mike Williams' disappearance never truly faded. It lingered like a storm cloud over those who had been closest to him, darkening the spaces between their lives, stretching further with every passing year. The official story had been accepted by most: a tragic accident, an unfortunate drowning, a man lost to the unpredictable waters of Lake Seminole. But for those who paid attention, for those unwilling to let the unanswered questions rest, the case remained an open wound. Cheryl Williams had never stopped searching. While others moved on, she clung to the certainty that something had happened to her son, something far worse than an accident. She wrote letters to law enforcement, pleading for them to reopen the case. She spoke to anyone who would listen, sharing her suspicions, outlining the inconsistencies, pointing out the gaps in the narrative that had been hastily stitched together. The life jacket, the insurance payout, the sudden remarriage, none of it sat right. But the world had stopped listening. At least that's what she thought. Behind closed doors, far from Cheryl's relentless pursuit of justice, cracks had begun to form in the carefully constructed facade that had kept the truth hidden. Brian Winchester was unraveling. For years, he had lived beneath the weight of something unspoken, something buried not just beneath the surface of the lake, but within his own mind. At first, it had been easy enough to carry. Denise was there, steady, in control, guiding the next steps of their lives with a calm certainty that left no room for doubt. But as time wore on, as the silence around Mike's name grew heavier, something inside Brian began to shift. He was no longer the man he had once been. The easy confidence that had once defined him was gone, replaced by an anxious edge that sharpened with each passing year. He became paranoid, convinced that someone was watching, that someone would put the pieces together. He drank more, withdrew from those who had once been part of his life. He avoided conversations about the past, flinched at the mention of Mike's name, grew restless in the presence of his own thoughts. And then there was Denise. Their marriage, which had once seemed like an unshakable alliance, was crumbling. She was not the same woman he had known before, not the person he had once trusted. She was cold, distant, more interested in maintaining control than in offering comfort. She dictated their lives with a precision that left no room for error, and for a while Brian had followed. But now he was beginning to see things differently. The cracks in their marriage were visible to anyone who looked closely enough. There were no outright fights, no violent arguments that spilled into public view, but there was tension. Thick, suffocating, inescapable. Denise controlled every aspect of their lives with an efficiency that bordered on ruthless. She made the decisions, handled their affairs, ensured that the past remained exactly where it needed to be, buried. But Brian was no longer certain he could keep it there. His paranoia grew. He started to feel as though Denise was watching him, that she was keeping tabs on his every move. The guilt, the weight of what had been done, the fear of exposure. It gnawed at him, eroding whatever trust had once existed between them. And then one night it reached its peak. It started with a conversation, one of many they had had over the years, always circling the same unspoken truth. But this time, something was different. Denise spoke with the same detached calm she always had, her voice cool, measured, deliberate. She reminded him, as she had before, that the past was just that, the past, that there was no reason to dwell on things that could not be changed, that what had been done had been necessary, but Brian could no longer pretend. The words lodged in his throat, the pressure building until it threatened to break him apart. He wanted to say it, to speak the truth out loud, to rid himself of the burden that had been crushing him for so long. But he knew deep down that it wasn't that simple, because Denise wouldn't allow it. She had always been in control. She had always dictated the terms. And if he tried to change that, if he tried to deviate from the carefully crafted story they had built, he knew what she was capable of. So he said nothing. But the fear never left him. It was only a matter of time before it consumed him entirely. And when it did, everything would come crashing down. Brian Winchester sat alone in his car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that his knuckles turned white. The air inside the vehicle was thick, heavy with something unspoken, something dangerous. His pulse pounded in his ears, drowning out the silence of the empty parking lot. He had come here to think, to clear his mind, but there was no escape. Not anymore. The weight of the last 16 years pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. He had spent years convincing himself that the past was behind him, that what had been done could remain buried, just like Mike Williams had remained buried in the swampy earth where he had fallen. He had followed Denise's lead, let her dictate the rules, let her control the narrative. But he couldn't do it anymore. His paranoia had grown into something all-consuming. He saw shadows where there were none, imagined whispers in conversations that had nothing to do with him. He had convinced himself that Denise was watching him, that she was waiting for him to slip. And the terrifying thing was, maybe she was. He had never feared her before. Not in the beginning, not when they had been bound together by shared secrets and unspoken truths, but now as their marriage disintegrated, as the unspoken tension between them thickened into something close to hostility. He realized something that sent a chill through his spine. Denise didn't need him anymore. For years they had operated under a silent agreement. They were in this together. If one of them fell, the other fell too. But now with their marriage crumbling, Brian had begun to wonder if she was looking for a way out. And if she was, what would she do to ensure that she remained safe? That thought had haunted him for months. The fear of exposure was a living, breathing thing inside him now, twisting itself into every quiet moment, creeping into his mind when he was alone. At night he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying every decision, every mistake, wondering if it had been enough to keep the truth hidden. And then there was Cheryl Williams. She had never stopped searching, never stopped asking questions, writing letters, pushing for answers. The case had been declared closed, but she refused to accept it. She had fought for years, and though no one had listened to her, Brian couldn't ignore the possibility that one day someone would. The walls were closing in. He needed to do something. The thought came suddenly, fully formed, as if it had been lurking in the back of his mind for months, waiting for the right moment to surface. It wasn't just paranoia. It wasn't just fear. It was survival. Denise was dangerous. He had seen it before, how easily she could manipulate, how effortlessly she had controlled the narrative after Mike disappeared. If she thought that he was a liability, she wouldn't hesitate. And Brian Winchester knew exactly what happened to people who became liabilities. The decision was made before he even realized he had made it. His hands moved on their own, reaching for his phone, dialing the number as his heart pounded violently in his chest. Denise answered after 2 rings. He took a breath. "We need to talk." The silence on the other end of the line was suffocating. Then finally, "I'll be home soon." He hung up, gripping the phone tightly, his mind already racing through the possibilities. He wasn't going to be her next victim. He wouldn't let it happen. Whatever came next, it would be on his terms. And if Denise thought she could control the ending of this story, she was about to find out just how wrong she was. Brian Winchester had spent years pretending that the past was nothing more than a series of unfortunate events, pretending that he could move forward, that life could continue as though nothing had happened, pretending that the choices he had made, the ones he had allowed himself to believe were necessary, could be buried alongside the truth. But the pretense was unraveling. It had been unraveling for years, slow and steady, chipping away at the fragile reality he and Denise had built. It started with small things, subtle shifts in Denise's demeanor, the way she had begun to distance herself, the cold calculation in her eyes whenever their past was even remotely mentioned. And then there was the fear, a constant presence lurking just beneath the surface, a fear that she was watching him, waiting for the moment he became a liability. Brian had spent years convincing himself that they were safe, that as long as they both stayed silent, as long as they both played their roles, there was nothing to worry about. But that was a lie. And now, standing in his own home, gripping a handgun with unsteady hands, he realized just how far gone he was. It wasn't supposed to be like this. The breaking point had come faster than he expected. The years of quiet tension had finally boiled over into something he could no longer ignore. He had become desperate, desperate to regain control, desperate to ensure that he wouldn't be the one left behind. And that desperation had driven him to do something reckless. The night before, after too many sleepless hours, after too many nights drowning in his own paranoia, Brian had made a decision that could not be undone. He had kidnapped Denise. It had not been a well-thought-out plan. It had not been a calculated move. It had been pure instinct, an act of survival from a man who had spent too long looking over his shoulder, too long convincing himself that he was the prey in a game he once thought he controlled. She had been sitting in her car, as she often did, looking at her phone, scrolling through something Brian would never know. He had waited until she was alone. He had waited until there was no one else around. And then he had slipped into the back seat. The look on her face when she saw him, fear, confusion, disbelief, was something he would never forget. For years she had been the one in control. For years, she had dictated the course of their lives. But not tonight. The gun had been heavy in his hand, but he had barely felt its weight. He hadn't needed to say much. She knew. She understood the moment she saw the look in his eyes. Drive, he had told her, and she had. For hours they sat in the car, parked on an empty stretch of road, miles away from anywhere significant. The silence between them was suffocating, thick with years of unspoken truths. Brian had wanted answers. He had wanted her to admit it, to say it out loud, to finally acknowledge what they both knew. But Denise was Denise. She did not break. She did not panic. Even with a gun pressed against her ribs, she had remained composed. That was what terrified him the most. She was fearless. She did not beg. She did not plead. She simply looked at him, waiting. It had been Brian who had lost control. It had been Brian who had started shouting, his words tumbling over each other in a mess of frustration and fear. He had threatened. He had cursed. He had tried to force something out of her, some kind of confession, some kind of acknowledgement. But she had given him nothing. And in the end, he had done what he always did. He had backed down. The moment he released her, the moment he let her go, he knew it was over. She would not forgive this. She would not forget it. And that was why, the next morning, he had been arrested. Denise had gone straight to the police, and Brian had known she would. There was no escaping this, no silencing what had happened. The kidnapping, the threats, the gun. It was enough to put him away for a long time. But Brian had something she didn't expect. For nearly 2 decades, Mike Williams had been a name written in cold case files, a puzzle with missing pieces that no one in law enforcement had been able to fit together. The official story had been accepted too easily. An unfortunate hunting accident, a man lost to the dark waters of Lake Seminole, a grieving widow moving on with her life. But now, with Brian Winchester's confession, everything changed. The Tallahassee Police Department had long since shelved the case, the pages of reports gathering dust in storage rooms. But Brian's admission forced the authorities to look at it again with fresh eyes. His confession wasn't just shocking. It rewrote the entire narrative of what had happened on the morning Mike disappeared. Law enforcement knew they had to tread carefully. Confessions alone weren't always enough to secure convictions, especially in cases that had remained unresolved for so long. There had to be more. Evidence, corroboration, something tangible that tied the crime together. Brian had given them the foundation, but now they had to build the case. Detectives sat across from Brian in an interview room, a small, dimly lit space designed to make men sweat, to make them talk. Brian didn't need the pressure. He was already talking, more than they expected, more than they had hoped. It was as if years of silence had broken all at once, and now he couldn't stop. He spoke about the plan, the way it had been carefully orchestrated, how Mike had been lured into a false sense of security. There had been no struggle, no chance for him to fight back. A single gunshot, quick, efficient, the kind of thing you planned when you didn't want mistakes. He described how the body had been disposed of, how they had buried Mike in a remote, swampy area, a place chosen for its isolation, for the way nature would do its work in erasing the evidence. Detectives pressed for more. They needed details. They needed to know where exactly Mike had been left to rot. A location, a landmark, something that would lead them to what was left of him. Brian hesitated. Memory faded over time, and guilt twisted recollections into something distorted. But he tried. He described the area as best he could, the terrain, the landscape, the feeling of the ground beneath his boots as they dug. And then, with a map spread out in front of him, he pointed. Investigators wasted no time. A search team was assembled, equipment loaded, ground-penetrating radar brought in to scan beneath the surface. The terrain was unforgiving, thick with mud and tangled with vegetation, the kind of place where things disappeared and were never meant to be found. But this time, they were looking in the right place. Days passed before they found the first sign that Brian had been telling the truth. Bones, not scattered, not moved by animals, but buried deliberately, as if someone had tried to ensure they would never be disturbed. The soil had shifted over time, erosion taking its toll, but there was enough left to know exactly who they had found. DNA confirmation was a formality at that point. Mike Williams had been buried in that remote location for 17 years. The discovery of his remains turned the case from theory to reality. It was no longer a question of whether Mike had been murdered, but who had orchestrated it. Brian had confessed to pulling the trigger, but investigators knew there was more to the story. They turned their attention to Denise. The financial records told their own story. The insurance policies, the rapid payout, the calculated efficiency with which she had moved on. Then there was her relationship with Brian. Too close, too quick after Mike's disappearance. The kind of thing that wasn't just suspicious but damning in the context of the newly uncovered truth. Prosecutors built their case meticulously. They knew they had one shot at securing a conviction, and they couldn't afford mistakes. They reconstructed the timeline, examined phone records, dug into old interviews. They found inconsistencies, contradictions, moments where Denise's actions didn't align with the grieving widow she had claimed to be. The moment came when she was finally brought in for questioning. The woman who had, for years, avoided scrutiny was now sitting in the same cold, clinical room where Brian had confessed. But Denise was not Brian. She was composed, careful with her words, choosing them like a chess player, anticipating the next move. She denied everything. She had no involvement, no knowledge, no part in any conspiracy. But the evidence was overwhelming. Brian had not acted alone. He had been part of something larger, something planned, something deliberate. Denise had not pulled the trigger, but she had set everything into motion. She had stood to gain everything. And when law enforcement laid the full weight of their case in front of her, the reality of her situation became clear. She would not walk away from this. The trial was coming, and for the first time, Denise Williams would have to answer for what had happened to her husband. The courtroom was silent, the weight of nearly 2 decades pressing down on everyone in attendance. For years, the case of Mike Williams had been considered closed. A tragic accident, a man lost to the unpredictable waters of Lake Seminole, a widow moving on with her life. But now the truth had emerged, and the people who had orchestrated his disappearance were finally facing justice. The trial of Denise Williams was more than just a legal proceeding. It was the culmination of years of suspicion, relentless investigation, and the tireless efforts of those who refused to let Mike's name be forgotten. The prosecution had built its case with meticulous precision, knowing that convicting Denise would require more than just Brian Winchester's confession. They needed to prove that she had been the mastermind, the architect behind the murder of her own husband. The prosecution's opening statement laid the foundation for what was to come. They presented Denise as a woman who had everything to gain from her husband's death, a woman who had manipulated those closest to her to execute a plan that left her financially secure and free from a marriage she no longer wanted. They detailed how Mike's disappearance had been orchestrated, how the life insurance policies had been set in place, how Brian Winchester had pulled the trigger, and how Denise had reaped the benefits. The jury listened intently as the prosecution methodically laid out their evidence. They started with the financial records, a paper trail that showed how Denise had ensured that Mike's life insurance policies were in order just months before his disappearance. The policies, totaling $1.75 million, had been processed with remarkable efficiency, a speed that raised suspicions even at the time. Prosecutors pointed out how Denise had pushed for Mike to be declared legally dead as soon as possible, ensuring that the money would be paid out without delay. Then came the timeline inconsistencies, the way Denise had reacted after Mike's disappearance. She had not campaigned for extended searches, had not expressed doubts about the official ruling, had not fought for answers like a grieving wife would be expected to. Instead, she had quickly accepted the explanation that he had drowned, despite the lack of a body. The jury was reminded that the life jacket found floating in the lake should have led to further questions, not closure. The prosecution then introduced Brian Winchester's confession, the most damning evidence of all. In his testimony, Brian detailed the events of the morning Mike was killed, how he had lured his best friend out onto the lake under the pretense of a hunting trip, how he had shot him, how he had buried the body in a remote location. But most importantly, Brian stated under oath that Denise had been involved from the beginning. She had not only known about the plan, but she had helped devise it. The defense, however, had a different story to tell. Denise's attorneys argued that Brian Winchester was an unreliable witness, a man trying to save himself by shifting blame onto someone else. They pointed to the fact that Brian had already secured a plea deal in exchange for his testimony, reducing his potential sentence in exchange for implicating Denise. They argued that there was no physical evidence linking Denise directly to the crime, that the entire case against her was built on circumstantial evidence and the word of a man desperate to escape the harshest consequences of his actions. But the prosecution wasn't done. They called in law enforcement officers who had worked on the case, officers who had reviewed Denise's statements over the years and noted the inconsistencies. They testified that Denise had changed details in her story multiple times, adjusting her narrative to fit the evidence as it emerged. Then came the recordings. During their investigation, law enforcement had obtained phone conversations between Brian and Denise, conversations in which she seemed more concerned about protecting herself than grieving her husband. The words weren't outright admissions of guilt, but they painted a picture of a woman who was deeply involved in covering up the truth. The jury was shown photographs of the crime scene, including the recovered remains of Mike Williams. The forensic evidence confirmed what Brian had described. Mike had not drowned. He had been murdered, his body deliberately buried, left in the wilderness where he was never meant to be found. Finally, Cheryl Williams, Mike's mother, took the stand. She spoke not just as a grieving mother, but as a woman who had spent 17 years fighting for the truth. She described her relentless pursuit, her refusal to accept the easy explanation, her determination to keep Mike's case in the public eye. Her testimony was emotional, raw, and compelling. It reminded the jury that this was not just a case about insurance money or legal technicalities. It was about a man who had been betrayed by the people he trusted the most. The defense fought back, arguing that none of this proved that Denise had actually conspired to have Mike killed. But as the trial progressed, it became increasingly clear that her role in the crime was undeniable. When the jury was finally sent to deliberate, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. The weight of nearly 2 decades of deception, of unanswered questions, of a carefully constructed lie, now rested in their hands. Hours passed. Then a verdict was reached. Denise Williams was found guilty of first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and being an accessory after the fact. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the sentence. Life in prison without parole. There was no dramatic reaction from Denise. She remained composed the same way she had remained composed throughout the years, the same way she had carried herself through every moment since Mike had vanished. But it was over. The truth had finally come to light. Justice, though delayed, had finally been served. The courtroom had emptied, the last echoes of the verdict still lingering in the air long after the judge had left the bench. The gavel had fallen, the sentence had been read, and the case of Mike Williams was finally closed. But for those who had spent nearly 2 decades searching for the truth, justice was not something that could be neatly wrapped up with a prison sentence. It was not something that erased the pain, nor did it bring back the man who had been stolen from them. For Cheryl Williams, the verdict had been both a victory and a loss. She had fought harder than anyone to uncover the truth, to force the world to listen when it had wanted to look the other way. She had written letters, made phone calls, begged authorities to keep searching when everyone else insisted there was nothing more to find. And now, after all the years of rejection, after the doors slammed in her face, after the nights spent wondering if she was the only one who still cared, she had finally been proven right. Her son had not drowned. He had not been lost in the lake. He had been murdered. But knowing the truth did not bring peace. There was no real closure for Cheryl, no undoing of what had been done. She had fought for justice, but justice was not the same as redemption. Mike was still gone, his life cut short by the very people he should have been able to trust the most. Denise Williams had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Brian Winchester, having confessed and cooperated, had been spared the harshest penalty, but would still spend years behind bars for his role in the crime. It was a strange kind of justice, one that came too late, one that had taken too much time, one that had cost too many years. In the days after the trial, news stations ran stories about the case, recounting its twists and turns, painting it as a crime of greed, deception, and betrayal. People shook their heads, whispered about how shocking it was, How unbelievable that someone could orchestrate the murder of their own husband for financial gain. But Cheryl did not need the headlines to tell her what she already knew. She had seen it coming before anyone else had. She had watched as Denise moved on too quickly, as the life insurance money was collected without hesitation, as Brian and Denise built their new lives on the foundation of a murder that they thought would never be uncovered. For 17 years, they had lived freely while Mike's remains lay buried in the wilderness, his name all but forgotten by the world. That, more than anything, was the true injustice. The case of Mike Williams highlighted something troubling about the criminal justice system: how easy it was for a crime to be dismissed, for an official explanation to be accepted despite glaring inconsistencies. Had it not been for Cheryl's persistence, had she not refused to accept the story she was given, Mike's fate would have remained buried alongside him. The initial investigation had been flawed from the start. The authorities had been too quick to label the case an accident, too willing to accept the idea that a man could simply vanish into the waters without leaving a trace. They had ignored the impossibility of the alligator theory, dismissed the inconsistencies in Denise's behavior, overlooked the suspicious timing of the life insurance payout. It was a reminder of how easily a case could slip through the cracks, of how justice often depended on those who refused to let go. At the heart of this case was betrayal, not just the betrayal of a man by his wife and best friend, but the betrayal of trust, the ultimate violation of human connection. Mike Williams had been a man who did everything right. He had worked hard, built a life, provided for his family. He had placed his trust in the people closest to him, never suspecting that the ones he loved the most were plotting his death. And for what? Money, freedom, convenience. Denise had wanted out of her marriage, but instead of leaving, instead of choosing an honest path, she had chosen the most selfish, irredeemable act imaginable. She had planned the murder of the man who had stood beside her, who had fathered her child, who had trusted her implicitly. Brian had been the weapon she used, the friend turned executioner, a man who had once stood beside Mike as a brother and had instead become his killer. In the end, they had both lost. Denise would spend the rest of her life behind bars, and Brian, even with a reduced sentence, would never be free of what he had done. It had all been for nothing. The story of Mike Williams serves as a cautionary tale about greed, about deception, about the lengths people will go to when they believe they can outsmart the system. But more than that, it is a testament to the power of persistence. Had Cheryl Williams accepted what she was told, had she given up as others urged her to, Mike's murder would have remained a secret. His killers would have lived out their lives unpunished, carrying their crime like a hidden scar, never having to answer for what they had done. Justice came late, but it came. And it came because one woman refused to stop searching. In the end, the case of Mike Williams is not just a crime story. It is a story of love, loss, and the unshakable resolve of a mother who refused to let her son's memory be erased. It is a story that reminds us that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, can never stay hidden forever. Thank you for watching our video. Please subscribe, follow us, and leave a comment. It truly helps us keep bringing you gripping and thought-provoking true crime stories